Answering the air quote unanswerable. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at questions that are claimed to be unanswerable by Christians. Well, we'll see about that. 12 questions we're going to be looking at are: where'd Cain get his wife? How did all those animals fit on the ark? Are the Old Testament and Jesus copycats? How do you know the Bible's reliable? Do Christians cherry pick what commandments to follow? Does God condone slavery? That is chattel slavery. How is God not murderous? How could Adam sin? Is God the cause of evil and sin? Is hell just? And also, therefore, why doesn't God forgive/save everyone? Why does God allow sin and suffering? This is also called the problem of evil. And is the resurrection true? First so-called unanswerable question: where'd Cain get his wife? Well, his sister. Adam and Eve were the first generation, so the second generation had to marry siblings or nieces and nephews of similar age. Even evolutionists partially agree to this because they too believe that all human beings originate from one original human being. So, either situation, siblings had to be marrying each other. And this is not incest, because incest is not a stagnant list of relatives from the beginning to the end of mankind. Which relatives it counts as incest if you have kids with them is based on if their closeness creates a high risk of birth defects, which is based on gene pool purity. As more and more human generations are created, more and more mutations happen, so the list of incestuous relative relations encompasses more relatives as time passes. Think about it. Abraham married his sister, and that was okay. Then Moses told the Israelites to marry first cousins but not siblings, because that would have been incest. And today, first cousin marriage is dangerous. Just ask Darwin from around 200 years ago. He married his first cousin and lost 2 children in infancy. Next question: how do all the animals fit on the ark? Well, first of all, only non-primarily aquatic vertebrates were on the ark, i.e., creatures that couldn't survive a year without dry land. And yes, it does include dinosaurs and pterosaurs. Genesis 7:8 says, of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, which refers to any winged vertebrate, not just avians, and of everything that creeps on the ground. And there were only 1 or 7 pairs of each Bearman, aka created kind, depending on the kind, which is not the same as species or breed, it's on a larger scale. It is a group of organisms that have distinct, separate genetics and lineages from other groups. Genesis 7:2-3 say, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So in total, it's actually less than 7,000 animals. And when it comes to, well, how big were they collectively? Well, as it said, it was to keep their offspring alive. So the point is for them to do as much reproducing as possible. So for that, you are going to take the most recently matured ones, as been calculated that then if you do that, the average size is about equal to the size of an adult sheep. So on the ark, you have 8 grown adults, human beings, and the equivalent to less than 7,000 adult sheep. No problem fitting all that on a boat that big. When it comes to what did they eat, well, all animals and mankind had a strictly herbivorous diet before the flood ended, whether you believe it or not. Genesis 1:30 says, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. Are the Old Testament and Jesus copycats? Because people will claim that the Old Testament was copied from earlier writings and that Jesus was copied from earlier gods. Well, when it pertains to the Old Testament, the flood is not copied because if Moses stole it, then everybody did. Scandinavians, Amerindians, and South Pacific Islanders all had their own flood story. And for those people so far distant in the world to all have a flood story makes you think. The Tower of Babel, Moses did not get the idea from the huge tower that was over in modern Iran. Because how could he have known about it? Moses grew up in Egypt and then died just outside of Canaan. You would have to prove that he would have known about a huge tower way over in modern Iran. Eye for an eye is not stolen from Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code was about revenge, while the Mosaic Law was about fair restoration. There are many contrasts between the two. And also the Old Testament has unique characters. Only the Imago Dei, man being made in God's image, is in the Old Testament, and only in the Old Testament did God make covenants between himself and human beings that did not exist in any pagan religion at the time. When it pertains to Jesus being copied from God myths, the closest candidate to the God Jesus was copied from, about half of the shared characteristics were added after Jesus lived, and the other about half of the characteristics that are shared between the two are not actually accredited to him. And all other candidates don't even come close. And consider the unique characteristics of Jesus, the two unified natures, humanity and divinity, Trinity membership, and the incarnation. Those things are completely unique to Jesus. And the bottom line is, it does not change the facts that Jesus was crucified and rose again 3 days later, that he is the God-man. How do you know the Bible's reliable? Meaning, how do you know it's the unchanged Word of God? Well, first of all, it's fair to assume that God can, does, and will preserve his Word. Also, we have many old copies that can be compared so that we know what the original text said. And if it were changed, then what did it originally say? Because if you know it's been changed, then you know what it said prior, what it was changed from. Also, it is consistent and historically accurate, and even more so than many other writings from its time and before. Also, consider the embarrassing details. Lot's sons being the product of Lot's daughters having relations with Lot while he was passed out drunk. Consider Hosea marrying a woman who he knew would be unfaithful and actually told by God that she would be unfaithful and to marry her. Think about God telling Isaiah to preach naked for 3 years. Think about when Noah got drunk. Think about Paul being the foremost of sinners. If you knew this was a lie and you wanted people to believe that this was the Word of God, why the heck would you put any of these details in there? And also, all the prophecies, except for many of the end times prophecies, are fulfilled. And the end times prophecies are yet to be fulfilled and haven't been disproven. Jesus alone fulfilled 300 of the Old Testament prophecies. Next, don't Christians cherry pick what commandments to follow? Well, first of all, there are 3 sorts of laws in the Mosaic Law: civil law, ceremonial law, and moral law. And it is the moral law that all human beings of all time and culture must follow. And we know which laws are part of the moral law because it is repeated in the New Testament and told to be followed. And we know we do not have to follow the ceremonial law because it was fulfilled by Jesus and said not necessary to be followed. People say, well, what about homosexuality and shellfish eating both being called abominations? Yes, both are called abominations because the Hebrew word has 2 uses. There's the ritual sense and the ethical sense. Shellfish eating is an abomination in the ritual sense. Homosexuality is an abomination in the ethical sense. Then you say, how do you know homosexuality is an abomination in the ethical sense? Because homosexuality is put in the same category as bestiality. In Leviticus 18:29, it refers to both bestiality and homosexuality when it says, "For everyone who does any of these abominations," which is one sense usage of abominations, "the persons who do them shall be cut off from among the people." Next, does God condone slavery? But when people say this by slavery, they mean chattel slavery specifically, which is the type of slavery we had over here in America. What God did in the Mosaic Law is he regulated lesser forms of servitude, either as a form of legal punishment or voluntary slavery, and did so not as an endorsement of owning human beings, but so that human beings who are owned would be treated like human beings to at least some degree. See, God did not endorse forcing slavery on anybody because forced enslavement was punishable by death in the Mosaic Law. Exodus 21:16 says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." And unrepented enslavers are damned to hell. 1 Timothy 1:10 tells us that enslavers do what is contrary to sound doctrine. People say, well, doesn't the Bible say that, hey, if you're a slave, just deal with it, really, basically? No. When the Bible talks about accepting being put in the position of being a slave, like in Ephesians 6:5-6, where it says, "Bondservants," that's slaves, "obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart." This is about focusing on serving God in the situation you're in, and instead of focusing on trying to get out of it. Because, like Joseph in the Old Testament, he was put in the position of slavery to do God's work. So it's about, no matter what situation you're in, even if it's being enslaved, don't be so quick to try and get out of it, because maybe you're in there for a reason. How is God not murderous? Because people say, oh, God kills so many people, so he's a murderer. Well, God can't be murderous because he's the creator of life, and therefore has right to do with it as he pleases, like an inventor has with his invention. If I invent something and have the patent for it, I can do whatever I want with it. I can make a copy of it, I can destroy it, I can add to it, and I can subtract to it. Because I made it, I have the rights over it. Also, every time God takes somebody's life, it is deserved, because everyone deserves death. And God is the highest being. So if he kills any other being, it cannot be murder, because they are lesser beings. People will say, well, what about the Canaanite air quote genocide? Well, the Canaanites were at least as bad as Nazis. These people burned their children alive. So if you don't think they deserve death, then you have a problem. Also, Canaan's curse went along with Israel's promise. The two went together. And only combatant men and certain cities' inhabitants were killed. God did not give Israel just one single command to kill every single living thing in Canaan. God gave various commands of who to kill, what to take, and what to leave alone. Many people in the conquest of Canaan were spared. People say, well, what about the children who died in the conquest of Canaan? Children who died were spared from being like their parents and ending up in hell, because the children that weren't burned alive would have grown up to burn their own children alive. And remember, this is a one-time thing. The conquest of Canaan and all the commands that went with it were a one-time thing, one situation thing. How could Adam sin in the garden? Well, first let's establish that Adam was sinless until after eating the fruit, had no inclination to sin, and had free will. Romans 5:12 says, "Therefore just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." What it was is from Adam's free will, he had the capacity to sin, but wouldn't without a sinful external influence, which was the serpent deceiving Eve. People say, well, if having free will gives you the capacity to sin, then what keeps you from sinning in the new creation and heaven? Well, you can't be sinfully influenced there, and you have a new righteous nature. Then they'll say, well, then how did Lucifer sin? Because his sin was the first sin. Well, in a similar way we do, it comes from free will and an absence of love for God. But also keep in mind that angelic beings are not humans. They have a different being than humans do. Next, is God the cause of evil/sin? No, of course not. They're the absence of righteousness, as death is the absence of life, or cold is the absence of heat. And God did not create them. Genesis 1:31, first part of the verse says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." For God to make evil and sin would be contradictory to his character because he is goodness in itself. What is God allows them by not causing good, by not making something be good, and it is purposeful. Proverbs 16:4 says, "The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble." See, evil and sin come from free will in the absence of righteousness. That's the cause of them. Next, technically two questions, but two questions that are greatly connected. Is hell just, and why doesn't God forgive/save everyone? Well, first of all, everyone earns hell. Romans 6:23, first part says, "For the wages of sin is death." So yes, hell is just. And hell is just even for those who haven't heard the gospel. People say, well, how can that be so? Well, there is no reason to assume that those who haven't heard the gospel would change. But there is reason to say that God knows that they wouldn't, even if they did hear it. Romans 3, second half of verse 11 says, "No one seeks God." Remember, we need God to save us. Romans 9:16 says, "So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy." And God has no obligation nor good reason to save everyone. And this is to show the fullness of his justice. Romans 9:22-23 says, "But if God, desiring to show his wrath, to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction," that's those who will see eternity in hell, "in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy which he has prepared beforehand for glory," those who will go to heaven. Next, what is considered probably the most unanswerable question, and that is, why does God allow sin and suffering, aka the problem of evil? Well, they're purposeful to show the full character of God. As I said earlier, that's part of why people do go to hell and why God doesn't save everyone. Also, consider, we would be robbed of so many good things without them. We would not experience mercy, forgiveness, grace, justice, redemption, and all the related things. We would never get to experience them without sin and suffering. And remember, sin is our fault. And because of our sin, we deserve suffering. And most importantly, never forget, God suffered too. But he didn't deserve it. God came down as a human being, lived a sinless life, and went through the most gruesome execution at that time in history, all without deserving any of it. So if he's not too good to suffer, then neither are we. Now for the most important so-called unanswerable question to know the answer to, and that is the resurrection true? Yes, because of three undeniable facts: the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, the empty tomb, and the testimonials of those who claim to have seen him resurrected. Now, early converts had no motivation but truth to claim that Jesus of Nazareth rose again, because Jesus' own apostle Thomas claimed before seeing him resurrected, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, I will never believe." So it must have been truth to make him go entirely 180 on that statement. And early martyrs, people who were willfully executed for claiming Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected, were in a position of certain knowledge. Luke 24:42-43 said, "They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate before them." For that fish to be there and then be gone, you're going to know for certain. People say, well, maybe they hallucinated it. Well, again, as earlier said, they had no motivation but truth. And also, mass hallucination does not work that way. 1 Corinthians 15:6 says, "Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still alive." Two people can't even hallucinate the same thing at once, let alone 500.